Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Talking Point presentation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today or in the future. We also recognise and value the knowledge and wisdom of people with a lived and or living experience of addiction, their families, carers and supporters. We celebrate their strengths and resilience in facing the challenges associated with their recovery and value their important role in the development and delivery of health and community services. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Venker and I'm the Manager of the Lived Experience Workforce and Advocacy at Turning Point, and I'll be facilitating today's Talking Point presentation, a spotlight on AOD, family, carer, supporter, lived experience workforce development, presented by Matthew Corbett and Rachael Matzka. Now, we like our webinars to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be collated and answered by our presenters at the end of today's presentation. Also, please be aware that our webinars are recorded and are later made available through the Turning Point website. Now, to our presenters, we have Matthew Corbett, who is the Manager of the Lived Experience Workforce Programs at SHARC, which is the Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre. They are the sector lead in lived experience workforce capacity building. Matt's role includes working with the AOD sector to consolidate and expand the lived experience workforces, including both consumers and family carers supporters, through training, supervision and consultation with both people with lived experience and the organisations that employ them. Matthew has over 30 years' experience in program, project leadership and training across a number of sectors. Having worked at SHARC for the last 5 years, he's combined these broader skills with his own lived experience. And if he wasn't busy enough, Matt is also a board member for Forensic Care. He's passionate about engaging with and serving the AOD lived experience communities and developing lived experience as a fundamental skill set in all relevant areas within sector organisations. We also are lucky enough to have Rachael Matzka with us, who is the Lived Experience Family Workforce Development Officer and holds a diploma of alcohol and other drugs to complement her extensive lived experience as an AOD family member. Having worked in the AOD sector for 6 years in several roles at SHARC, Rachael has a passion to see the AOD family carer supporter lived experience workforce grow and have a sustained presence and a voice at all levels of the service system. Having previously worked on the Our Future project, which was a dedicated effort in lived experience workforce capacity building, Rachael is excited to contribute further to the growing presence of lived experience across the mental health and AOD sectors. We thank both Matthew and Rachael for being here today, and I'll now pass it over to Matthew.
Hi, Ben. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank Ben and Faye and the team here at Turning Point for the invitation to come and share what we're working on in the family lived and lived experience workforce space. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be able to come and talk about it today. I won't expand too much on what Ben said about me, but I think it's important to note that I have my own lived experience of both AOD and mental health. And had no intention of working in this sector, but got asked to do some volunteering at SHARC about 8 years ago as a peer worker, and finally then realised what I wanted to do when I grew up. It became my passion, and I've worked in and on lived experience ever since. And, you know, as the program's going at SHARC, I've had the fortune to be able to grow into a leadership role in a really busy and active area. Most of my work's been in the consumer space, but the awesome thing and what we're here to talk about today is that there's now recognition of the importance of building a workforce in the family carer space, in the lived experience space, and we've started the journey to professionalise what is largely a volunteer organisation. I won't take any more of Rachael's thunder by going into that too much, but thank you for being here. And it's a real pleasure to be able to share what we're doing. I'll hand it over to Rachael.
All right, thanks, Matthew. So just to add to my intro, I've been at SHARC for 6.5 years, and much like Matthew, I didn't want to come into the AOD sector at all, but I got tapped on the shoulder, got a role, and the rest is history. So here I am, and I'm really excited to be with you all today to shine a spotlight on what we've been doing in the AOD Family workforce development space.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll talk about it more broadly in the presentation, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there's so much work happening in the lived experience workforce space, both in AOD and mental health, and both from a consumer and family carer perspective. And just acknowledging the Royal Commission into the Victorian mental health system and the emphasis and spotlight that it put on lived experience has created the opportunity for more time, attention, and funds to be put towards developing this really important work. It is a little bit be careful what you wish for, though it's been an incredibly busy couple of years and will continue to be, but I wouldn't have it any other way. But it's an important acknowledgement, I think, that sort of created the groundswell that we're currently experiencing. I just want to talk quickly and a little bit about SHARC. So SHARC is the Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre. It has lived experience in its DNA. Basically, since its establishment, SHARC's models of practice and service delivery have been underpinned by lived experience and peer support. Most of the programs have been created from a group of people with lived experience coming together and exploring ways to be able to provide services where there weren't any and where they saw the need. So from the very start, it's been a fundamental part of what we do. Most of the roles at SHARC, including my own and Rachel's, are designated lived experience roles. So, it underpins everything that we do. We've got a few programs, which I'll quickly run through. We've got our residential peer programs, which are in-community residential programs for people that are wanting to change their relationship with substances. And we've got a youth program, which is in community housing, but also a full-time day program that we run at SHARC, as well as Oxford Houses and Us Women's, which are more, three-quarter way living. So these people have usually been through the change process and are wanting to reintegrate back into, independent living. And this is a great way to do that safely and, from being supported along the way. Family drug and gambling help, which is a big part of, what we're about and a big part of what we're doing and talking about today. We have a number of services. We've got a peer-led helpline, which is staffed by volunteers who have their own lived experience and the training to be able to provide support through that helpline. And we have a number of support groups throughout Victoria, including online, which are also run by people with volunteers with lived experience and have done some training around group support, as well as some psychoeducational programs, some in conjunction with Turning Point, who we're working with today, really about, educating people around addiction and what that looks like and how to look after themselves and their loved ones as they move through the process. We have the Association of Participating Service Users, which is our advocacy arm for both service users and families. And a big part of what we do now is also around the consumer engagement. Another nice thing that came out of the Royal Commission was the emphasis on ensuring that consumers are included as early as possible in any kind of development. And so APS has been very busy building, a membership of people that are trained and willing and ready and to participate in a number of ways. So it's grown quite a lot since the Royal Commission. And Peer Projects, which is the program I manage, which is all around lived experience workforce capacity building. We work with both organisations and individuals who are wanting to train and learn about lived experience and how to utilise it effectively and safely. We provide things like discipline-specific supervision to a number of peer workers working in the sector. And we also have a Peer Mentors in Justice program where we have a group of peer workers that are working with participants of several of the drug court programs here in Melbourne, which is a really fun, it's been a foundational shift in the way participants experience those programs and continues to grow and is quite well regarded. So there's a lot happening. And as I said, be careful what you wish for sometimes. It gets pretty busy. But I'll hand it over to Rach to go on to the next slide.
All right, thanks, Matthew. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of background on how we got here today in AOD Family Workforce Development. So, inclusion of AOD family workforce development and capacity building came from recommendations in the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. I'll just call it the Royal Commission from here because it's too long to say. And also from the Our Future project in 2021. So the recommendations identified that a dedicated effort in AOD family workforce development was needed to support and enhance family inclusive practice across both the mental health and AOD sectors. And the commissioning of the AOD Family Lived and Living Experience Workforce Discipline Framework, which I'll call the framework for shorter reasons, is intended to be a first step in addressing those recommendations. So there have already been some key steps in family workforce development in the mental health sector, like the development of the strategy for the family carer mental health workforce in Victoria in June 2019. I'd love to see the same for the AOD family workforce, and we have a great foundation to reference thanks to our allies in mental health. Another important step has been the development of the mental health family carer discipline framework alongside this framework here, which is currently underway at Tandem, which is really exciting. So collaboration between SHARC and Tandem on this project has been really, really valuable in driving both of the workforces forward. So you can chop that out. So you can see that professionalisation of family leaves is relatively new for both the mental health and AOD sectors. Our allies from mental health, family care, and lived experience workforce have and will continue to be a key partnership in forging the path forward across both the AOD and mental health sectors for the family leaves, which is really exciting. It is absolutely worth noting here that where we are now in family workforce development follows years of tireless efforts in advocacy for both of the workforces. But this is a time where we're finally seeing real investment in it, which is fantastic. So I'll just speak a bit to the Our Future project. So this was a key catalyst for family workforce development. So the project was a partnership between several mental health and AOD agencies with SHARC as the lead. And we were all working together to forge a path forward for all the lived experience workforces across both mental health and AOD. So the primary purpose of the Our Future project was to conduct an audit of available training for the lived experience workforces across mental health and AOD, develop a desired content list for each of those cohorts, and then to provide a set of recommendations for training and workforce development requirements for each workforce moving forward. Now, the audit revealed that there were no AOD family-specific training products. However, several training products were found to be beneficial for AOD family work. So that's IPS core training and advanced training, MARAM training and mental health first aid, things like that. Then after the audit, as I said, a desired content list for a first iteration of an AOD family leave-specific peer worker training was developed, and recommendations for workforce development and support were posited in the final report for consideration by the Department of Health. Now, there were several recommendations in the Our Future final report, but recommendation 6 in particular was the one that identified that need for real investment in workforce development across all the lived experience workforces. And this really spoke to the need for, I guess, the creation of the appropriate infrastructure to support that growth and development. And this is where the idea of a discipline framework across all of the workforces came into mind and came into discussions. So this is the full set of recommendation 6, which I won't go into detail here for the sake of time, but the main gist of it is that all lived and living experience workforces across the mental health and AOD sectors required significant investment and resources for workforce development, as I mentioned before. So, of course, the discipline frameworks were just one of the needs identified as a first step. And if you'd like to see the full set of recommendations, you can jump onto the SHARC website under the publications page for the final report. You can have a flip through that there. So we're just going to play a recording of a quote that really sets the scene for the impetus behind AOD family lived and living experience work. Now, while it does come from a parent perspective, the same basic principle can be applied to anyone supporting a service user. So if support is available for the supporter, there are real benefits for everyone. So I'll just play that now.
If parents had someone to talk to, someone who understood, who had been in that position or was in it now, then this could provide emotional relief and take off some of the pressure. This, in turn, may reduce the stress in their relationship with their child, improve communication, and have a possible beneficial effect all round for the family.
Found that really, really powerful because it really is the same basic principle across the whole cohort, no matter what your perspective as a parent, a cousin, a sibling, whatever it is. As long as there's support for everyone, everyone can benefit. Okay, so now we'll delve a little bit more into the history of the AOD Family Lived and Living Experience workforce. So as you can see, this is a visual representation of the history of the family workforce. We speak to it more in the discipline framework itself, so you'll have to wait for that to be released in June to read the full version. But I'll just give a little snapshot here of the key points. So that first little bubble here. So peer-led support began in the 1950s with Al-Anon and other non-profit mutual aid societies leading support groups of families, carers, supporters and kin. Then in 1998, a group of Victorian family members, advocates and community members established a peer support group run on a voluntary basis initially. From these efforts, a peer-led service was built in 1999, initially on a voluntary basis again, and continues to operate today. So that's our Family Drug and Gambling Help program at SHARC, or as it was known back then, Family Drug Help. Then in 2000, the Association of Participating Service Users at SHARC, or APSU, they were established to support family involvement in AOD policy, system and service design. This is also the time where we began to see paid specialist AOD family emerging in Victoria. However, the AOD family workforce was and continues today to be largely part-time or casual, and it is subject to year-to-year funding, as most of us know. So this has meant that there is less secure employment, which has potentially impacted on retention rates, and this is something that still needs to be addressed and that we're actively advocating for at SHARC. So moving forward into the 2000s and 2010s, we saw Family Drug Help continue to grow and employ AOD family lived and living experience workforce, with continued lobbying to state government to support the growth of that and to be able to provide more peer-led support for families. Then in 2020, APSU developed a guide for family participation in AOD policy, system and service design to further enhance family involvement. And this was to really shine a light on more family inclusive practice within both the AOD and mental health sectors. Then in 2021, the Our Future project was undertaken, which we spoke to in the previous slide, so I won't go into more detail here. Then in 2022, the inaugural AOD Lived Experience Family Advisor role was created in the Lived Experience branch of the Department of Health. And then later in that same year, the inaugural AOD Family Lived Experience Workforce Development Officer role, that's me, was created. So this is when development of the AOD Family Workforce Discipline Framework started. And that's now under final review before being published in June 24 this year, as I mentioned, which is very exciting. But again, it's worth noting that there's been years of advocacy and tireless work by those who've gone before us. And because of that, the AOD Family Lived and Living Experience workforce is growing. And of course, that has also come as a result of recommendations from the Royal Commission, the Our Future project, and further investment in workforce development through this project where the discipline framework is funded under. So that is the Lived and Living Experience Workforce Development Project, and that has been running since 2022. So you can see there's a rich history of advocacy for the AOD family workforce, and it's encouraging to see it continue to grow and develop. Now, I've been talking for a while, so I'll hand over to Matthew to speak through our engagement strategy and process in developing the framework.
Thanks, Rach. A couple of things I didn't mention earlier when I was talking about what SHARC does. Some very important programs in the family drug and gambling help program. We have our In Focus program and our Breakthrough program, which are both educational programs aimed at families who want to better understand what addiction is and how to support their loved ones and look after themselves. They are also delivered by people with lived experience, and we work with Turning Point in conjunction to deliver the Breakthrough program as well. But the other one I wanted to mention is in the new space of family drug and gambling help, which is in the gambling space, which is a program called Three Sides of the Coin. It's a performance theatre-based program that is, if you ever get the opportunity to see it, please do. It's an incredibly moving experience where people with lived experience of gambling harm are directed to write their story and perform it as part of the program. So you're not looking at actors, you're actually having people performing their own lived experience and it's incredibly moving and powerful. So if it ever comes your way, definitely get along to see it. So the goal was to engage
Matzka to go in.
AOD family voice to drive the development of the framework. And we knew it was important for the framework to be by the AOD family lived and living experience community for the AOD family lived and living experience workforce. And now, of course, we weren't alone in that journey. We collaborated with our partners and allies from the Department of Health, also within SHARC and the Family Drug and Gambling Help team, as well as Tandem Carers and the CLUE organisations in the mental health sector. We were very grateful to be able to work with them, and I think all of the work we've done benefited from being able to interact and connect with those agencies. So opportunities to participate in the framework development were communicated through several channels to gauge interest through VADA, SHARC Network, the APSI membership, and as far and wide as we could go amongst our own communities. And we started off with a sector-wide survey, and we had 2 workshops and individual interviews as well that gave us the opportunity to get some really robust feedback from the workforce. And we ended up having exactly 33 AOD family lived and living experience workers and allies involved, which is quite a significant uptake for a relatively small workforce. If you go to the next slide, that would be great. Oh, thanks. So we got a lot of great feedback. We had 14 workers from that community complete the survey. And the quote here really stuck out as it captures the work of an AOD family lived experience workforce, quite well. So, Rach, can you just play that and hopefully we can hear this one?
A family peer worker is part of a care team in a clinical setting. In fact, a family peer worker has many faces. They perform many roles. They are an expert in their own right. They are a shoulder to lean on. They are someone who can help steer the ship when the family member is unable to make sense of things, and they can be change makers in people's lives. They are empathic humans who care and understand the struggles.
So the survey prompted us to include things like the language of expertise when we talked about the AOD family lived experience. Families as having living experience also, which is why we've included this when we reference the workforce now. A much bigger focus on no longer being alone as a benefit of building and sustaining an AOD family peer workforce. The concept of marginalisation and using lived experience of this in the practice when we're working in the lived and living experience role. Another key theme was navigating grief. Lost family members or having family members who aren't themselves anymore due to substance use or addiction. And we also acknowledge that those who work in this space have lost a family member. We looked at terms like chosen family and kin in language disclaimers in recognition that families look and are defined differently by different people. And we also have to think about a definition of recovery for families that entails acceptance of the situation and their power or lack of in that situation. This is where we explore the concept of relational recovery, which we'll get to a little bit later. So a little bit about the process we went through around the workshop. The first workshop we had 6 AOD family workforce people, lived and living experience workforce people attending. The largest representation came from peer workers. However, we also had research, governance, and dual diagnosis representation. We started by posing potential values for the group to consider to get the juices flowing. And then we used the word cloud to find out more from the participants. And as you can see here from the final word cloud, we had a lot of values come through. Respect, hope, empathy, inclusion, integrity, advocacy, and relationships, and so on. So thankfully, we saw that having lived experience was a strong value, that it was held amongst the AOD family lived and living experience workforce, which is, thank goodness, really, very important component. There was a stronger emphasis than expected on healing, which was interesting. This makes so much sense as, it is really central to the family recovery process and experience. There's no moving forward without some kind of healing of self and of the relationship between the family member and their loved one. So this was a really prominent thing that came through. Of all the values, the group then determined the most important 6, and providing context as to how each of these values would look in an AOD family lived and living experience worker practice. And these were then drafted into the discipline framework. So a week later, we had the second workshop, which centred on exploring and capturing the skills and knowledge and scope of practice of the AOD family lived and living experience workforce. It's a very long title. We'll have to work on that, Rach. We had 8 people attend this time, and most of whom had attended the first workshop, which was also very encouraging. To draw out the skills and knowledge required to be in an AOD family lived and living experience worker role, we used the word clouds again to capture some of the skills and tasks and knowledge required for each individual group member's role. So you can see here there are a number of these required to fulfill the role of an AOD family LLE worker. That's better. So lived experience, again, a positive sign, but you can see there's things like networking and self-reflection, communication, critical thinking, sitting in the grey, which is a really interesting, I think, skill, particularly because there is a lot of grey in the family LLE space or workforce space, particularly in organisations, because this is a whole new workforce. They're still trying to work out how to implement a consumer lived and living experience workforce. So then having to sort of look at what that looks like for families means there's a lot that's not quite known and not fully understood. But other things like intentional peer support and mental health first aid were also seen as valuable training products or tools. These were identified in Our Future project, so it was great to see that they were reinforced. And looking at things like the national drug policy, trauma-informed care, advocacy functions, a knowledge of referral pathways was also really important. And I should add, most of these applied directly to the consumer workforce as well. So it's great to see the same things reflecting in the family space. But as you can see, we've got a lot of rich input from these word clouds. So we explored through further discussion within the workshop. And again, all of this feedback was themed and then fed into and drafted into the framework. So to then we wanted to look at the scope of practice. So we basically used a Miro board for the group to be able to contribute to which would inform key competencies required for the workforce, which we'll come back to in a few slides. Oh, it's still me. That's a long slide list. So what we noticed in the workshops was that whilst the peer worker perspective was well represented and captured, there were some family loo roles that we felt were underrepresented. And so we wanted to, that for whatever reason, they couldn't make the workshop times, or they hadn't sort of been fully aware of what we were doing. But we really wanted to capture these, in particular, more information from the research component, other areas like practice leads or culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So we ended up scheduling some individual interviews with the representatives for each of those to allow time and space for the nuance within those roles to be explored in a really meaningful way, with the goal to being able to ensure that everyone in the consultation process could see themselves on the page of the final discipline framework, which was really important for us to make sure we captured that. Now it's back to you, Rach.
All right, thanks, Matthew. And I'm so with you on shortening the lived and living experience workforce language. It does get a bit of a mouthful after a while. Okay, so you're probably thinking, okay, you've done all this consultation, got all this data and feedback. So what content is actually in the discipline framework? Now, without ruining the surprise in June when it's published, here's a visual representation of what will be in there, and I'll give a little bit more detail into each of these on the next few slides. However, we've already spoken to definitions before when we spoke about the survey a few slides back. Okay, so the first section is values. Now, I'll briefly go through the final values that we landed on. So the first one is connection, and it was one of the most important ones. And this is where AOD family workers recognise connection as foundational to their relationships. It's a fundamental enabler in peer relationships and is, of course, grounded in shared AOD family experience. Connection builds relationships and a sense of community where families can move from isolation, stigma, and shame to belonging and acceptance. Then we had empathy. And this is where AOD Family Lived and Living Experience workers practice empathy from a position of vulnerability and authenticity in relationship. It's the ability to recognise themselves in another without judgment. And this identification can result in a deeply connective experience where families, perhaps for the first time, realise they're not alone in their experience. Then the next one was healing. And this is where AOD family workers promote family healing. They work to empower families to move forward on their own self-determined journey of healing of themselves and of the relationship between them and their loved one experiencing substance use or addiction. This is where the concept of relational recovery comes in, which I'll touch on soon. Then we have empowerment. Now, AOD Family Lou practice is strength-based. It's underpinned by hope and recognition that each person can create a life that is meaningful for them. AOD Family Loos operate from a place of common humanity and vulnerability, recognising that goals, values, beliefs, and choices are unique to each person, and that this includes the recognition that a person is the expert in their own experiences and that their journey should be self-directed. Our next value is inclusion. And lived experience work has its origins in advocacy for inclusion, social justice, and human rights. AOD Family Loos elevate the right for families to be involved in decisions that impact them through direct and meaningful engagement in service and system design and delivery. AOD Family Loos are also change agents who actively influence, advocate, improve service culture and quality, and enhance the delivery of supports for families. They do this through amplifying that collective family voice to guide the transformation of systems, services, policies, and laws to really, highlight more family inclusive practice like we've spoken to before. Then finally, we have community. And this is an acknowledgement that AOD Family Lived and Living Experience work is part of the rich lived and living experience community. This value emphasises collaboration across all of the workforces, where we share our experiences, perspectives, approaches, passions, and expertise to help build the workforce further. Then our next section is the scope of practice. So I'll bring you back to the second workshop where we held, which was where we incorporated that Miro board that Matthew mentioned a few slides back. So you can't see it here very well. I tried to stick it in there so that you could, but it's not working. But we made quite a large Miro board to allow for really detailed contribution from everyone in the workshop. I'll note here that at this time we were referring to skills and knowledge as the core competencies. However, that language changed because there was a bit of confusion with some of the training products that we were developing and the language there around core competencies. So we had to change it to skills and knowledge. So in the framework, we go into more detail on these, but for the sake of time, I'll keep it brief. So while roles and responsibilities within organisations vary, AOD Family Lived and Living Experience roles typically include informational support and individual advocacy. So this is primarily focused on empowering families with information, but also includes the provision of specific information about services, systems and rights, system navigation, or direct advocacy for individual needs. And then we have systemic advocacy. Now, this is where advocacy at policy and service system levels is delivered by AOD family workers, and it's often connected to that collective voice of the families. So workers here understand that individual experience is connected to system change, and they're driven to improve those services and outcomes by championing the family voice. Then we have peer support, which is, of course, where AOD Family Lived and Living Experience workers build relationships based on a collective understanding of the shared family experience, self-determination, empowerment, and hope. Then we have skills and knowledge. So, of course, AOD Family Lived and Living Experience workers require unique skills and knowledge to perform their roles. Now, a set of AOD family-specific skills and knowledge were formed through consultation in the second workshop by all the participants. And we found that there was a need to articulate the wider workforce and also role-specific skills and competencies. Again, we go into more detail on these in the framework, but for the sake of time, I'll keep it brief. So for the wider workforce skills and knowledge, we go through and detail what this looks like practically in terms of professional practice, learning and professional development, connection and communication, and self-determined wellbeing. So what that looks like in a day-to-day role. Then we move into role-specific skills and knowledge, which is where we zoom in on practical application of peer support. So this is based on a peer worker's ability to initiate and develop ongoing peer relationships and sets out better practice standards for AOD family workers in peer support practice. Then we have informational support and individual advocacy again, and this includes the provision of specific information about services, systems and rights, system navigation, like we mentioned before, but kind of steps it out a bit more in practical ways. Then we talk about partnership approaches, and we go into a bit about co-design, community engagement, networking, planning, evaluation, facilitation, and communication skills, and what those look like for AOD family workers in these types of roles. And then, of course, again, we have systemic advocacy. So this is where AOD family workers, such as advisors and workforce development officers, they work strategically to affect positive change in service delivery and organisational culture for AOD family lived and living experience workforces. So those are the three main sections in the framework. So we have values, scope of practice, and skills and knowledge. So now I'll hand it back to Matthew to speak about the language we've used in the framework.
So I just wanted to acknowledge, I think that, we know language is a very fluid construct at the moment, and that it's a highly subjective one, that both from a personal and a professional view, and that we're never going to get it right for everyone. But we went with language, I guess, drawn largely from terminology aligned and outlined in the power of words, having alcohol and other drug conversations, a practical guide, and then also the preferred terms adopted by the final report from the Royal Commission. And we know that that might not be the language that you use to talk about the same things, and we definitely acknowledge that. But, ultimately you've got to kind of choose what your language is going to be, and then be consistent with that. But we wanted to acknowledge that, it's not all the same for everybody. And even things like using the word family, in the framework, it refers to family of origin and family of choice, and the range of relationships and social connections and supports that many people have in their lives. And the LLEW community or family community, see family it's inclusive of biological and non-biological relatives, intimate partners, ex-partners, people in cohabitation, friends, those with kinship responsibilities, and even others who play a significant role in the service user's life. So it's all encompassing. I think, while the choice of language is where we landed in the framework, of course, again, acknowledging that, that might not apply for everybody. Similarly, we use the term service user instead of consumer. I know there's lots of different ways that people who access services are defined, but for us, service user felt right for both, I guess, for SHARC and the communities, the family communities, both from a workforce and a broader community perspective. And so I guess, again, we know that there's consumer, patient, client, participant, and acknowledging that they might be the way you describe your service users, but for us, that was where we landed. We did find that we struggled in the consultations with lifting the language up to be inclusive of the broader AOD family lived and living experience workforce. And this is not a challenge, but it's a really interesting time in the lived experience and living experience space, because for a long period of time, lived experience equaled peer work. And whilst it's still probably the predominant role, it's certainly now being thought of in a much broader sense of what does a lived and living experience workforce look like beyond peer work. We're going through that in the consumer space, but we're also definitely going through it in the family space. And how do we define the language to be able to lift up and be inclusive of all the role types? Because it's important that we don't accidentally exclude people that are working in roles, in lived experience roles. So I think back to you, Rach, for the last one or couple.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. So now for the exciting part where we get to think about what we want to see in the future for AOD family workforce development. So the framework is intended to be a high-level foundational document to inform development, growth, and future investment, really, in AOD family workforce development. So we want to see things like career development and trajectory planning. We want to see specific training products, both organisational and individual peer worker training. We want to see family-specific supervision frameworks, and we would also love to see family-specific networking and professional development opportunities. So things like communities of practice and forums and other networking opportunities where we can really connect in with each other and sort of get together and talk about how we can build that workforce and talk about, the challenges and the opportunities that we've been encountering thus far, and to really just build from there. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about is the unique value of AOD Family lived and living experience work. Now, of course, all of us AOD Family people know the unique value of our work, but I want to touch on it here to highlight why it's worth investing more into. So what makes AOD Family unique? Now, quite obviously, we have first-hand personal knowledge of the family experience within the AOD sector. We know the challenges families face when interacting with the AOD sector and the teams involved in providing support for us and for our loved one, whilst also having to navigate the powerlessness we can sometimes feel in relation to the journey of our loved one. We've learned that it's crucial for families to feel empowered and to have the self-determination to get the support they need for their own well-being, regardless of where their loved one is at. We know that navigating the AOD and mental health systems can be hard for family members, the frustration at times at the toing and froing between services, and can relate to that really, really well. From our experience, we know what supports are out there, what's worked for us, and we can help to guide families in the direction they want to go for the supports they need. We also know the value of harnessing the voices of families to drive efforts in providing more family-inclusive practice in services. We know that this proves beneficial for all involved, and we are seeing a greater shift towards this after the Royal Commission, which is fantastic. This is where AOD Family Lou can and do really shine and prove the value of ourselves as a workforce in enhancing family-inclusive practice. You might remember we mentioned relational recovery earlier in the presentation. There is a big focus on this in AOD Family Lou work. So relational recovery is a process of working towards independence whilst maintaining meaningful connection with a loved one. It focuses on the healing of self first and the mechanisms required to protect personal well-being long-term in the relationship between the family member and their loved one. The second part to relational recovery focuses on the dynamic between the family member and their loved one. So how that looks moving forward in the relationship, considering the family member's rediscovered sense of self and well-being as a result of that first part of relational recovery. So those are just a couple of the unique points in AOD family work. I could go on, but I know I'm running out of time and that we do have questions to get to, so we will keep moving. And I'll hand it over to Matthew to talk about the immediate next steps after the framework is published in June this year.
Thanks, Rach. So I am aware we're running a little bit over, but we wanted to share a bit about the immediate next steps and where to from here. And SHARC and our colleagues in the mental health sector are actively working with the Department of Health, advocating for further funding and investment in the AOD Family LLE workforce development. We've got that initial opportunity and initial funding to lay the foundational frameworks, and now we're wanting to make sure we can come behind that and build the next layer of tools and training programs, etc. Things that already exist that we've either developed or co-developed in the consumer space, like organisational readiness training for agencies that are wanting to implement a lived and living experience workforce, development of peer worker training specifically for that family community. We have that in place for the consumer roles, but yeah, wanting to really come with a product or a training that's specifically for and tailored to families. As well as another really important part of it is building a family-specific supervision framework. So we like to call it discipline-specific supervision in the lived experience community, because we don't want it to be, I guess, identified or thought of as clinical. So we've worked really hard to develop a supervision framework and program for people that are working in consumer lived experience roles, but really doing the work to understand what that needs to look like from a family perspective as well, and being able to provide that, because we know that discipline-specific supervision is such an important part of the work and the role of a lived experience workforce. So watch this space. We're really hoping that we can come behind the work that we're doing now and follow through and actually start to really lay those critical foundations for the workforce going forward. So over to you, Rach, for the last little bit.
So all of the work we're doing is essentially about transforming a broken system. Now, it's vitally important that we work on this together to continue seeing forward movement, not only for the AOD family workforce, but for all of the lived experience workforces. As a sector, we know how to come together and do the important work we do despite the adversity. But there are a couple of things I want to note. The incredible pace of change and the complexity of the work that SHARC does in a lived experience workforce capacity building has meant that sometimes we forget to put our heads up and practice the very essence of lived and living experience, which is connection, the human experience, walking beside rather than pushing from behind or pulling from the front. We continue to advocate for more funding to be able to support all parts of the sector equitably, rather than just those who have some room in their budget. And in the spirit of inclusion, we will look for ways to regularly engage with the sector to inform and understand how we're going to work through this together. It's only truly an interdisciplinary system if LU is fully and intentionally integrated. And it's going to take a commitment from all of us to stand up the LUs carefully and sustainably within this interdisciplinary system. So thank you. Thank you for everyone for being here today. And of course, to Turning Point for having us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well done, Rachel. Well done, Matt. Thank you both very much for that presentation. It was really insightful and really exciting to see what's coming this year. Looking forward to June and having that framework released, and also great to see the work that's still to come from SHARC as well. So thank you both for sharing that with us today. We have had a few questions come in, so I'll just, while we've got a little bit of time left, try and get to as many as we can. So we've got a question here from a viewer from over in Tasmania. Do these family, friend, carer, peer workers need to have any qualifications, or is there any relevant peer work quals in Victoria? We do have mental health peer work quals here in Tasmania, and they are preferred in the mental health peer work space, but none that I'm aware of for AOD peer workers.
So currently in the AOD space, there's no accredited training. There is the mental health peer work cert for that's specifically targeted to that sector. So the answer in the short term is no, there's nothing accredited, but and without advertising our products, because that's not the intention, we have a 5-day peer worker training program that we've put together, which is essentially seen as the benchmark for AOD peer work and turning lived experience into lived expertise. So that's what we have now. And then we also have a few targeted things around group support and things like that. But certainly this next sort of period of work is going to be looking at what sort of qualifications do we need, and what sort of accredited training programs do we need? It's a fairly, the wheel turns pretty slowly in that space. So I don't think it'll be in the immediate future, but we're certainly looking at how we can, better regulate and develop a training program without losing the magic and essence of peer work. So,
Right, thank you, Matt. Another one here. Great overview. Thank you, Matthew and Rachel. Fantastic to see greater shift towards family-focused practice. What consideration is being made about family and carer lived experience workers in the dual diagnosis mental health AOD space?
It's a very good question. I think that it's a really interesting time in the dual diagnosis space, even for consumer peer work. I think that, interestingly, a lot of people who turn towards peer work and lived experience work often have a dual diagnosis, so they kind of bring both with them anyway. But I guess, that process of how do you integrate them into a dual diagnosis program is something I haven't personally had a lot of experience with. We tend to work mainly with either AOD specific or mental health specific, but we've worked in community health centres that have both as well. So my view, Rach might have a different view, is I guess it's the family side of it is still, we've got a fair bit of work to do to get them actually professional first and then have them integrated fully into a interdisciplinary team. But we're still in that, we're still doing that with the consumer workforce as well. I don't know if that answers the question, but Rach, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so kind of just off the back of what you've said, like we are at the very beginning of developing this workforce. And I guess there has been pieces of work done on the integration between mental health and AOD. We have seen those pieces of work come through. I guess they do go so hand in hand so often, and we know that, and we've seen that time and again. But it seems that there is like a particular nuance with mental health and with AODs that we've seen the need to, I guess, really define each really, really well and give both of them the respect that they deserve. So whilst we've had this piece of work that we're developing on, I know mental health family care have also had their own discipline framework that they're developing as well, that I mentioned earlier. And I guess it really, well, for me personally, I come back to wanting to be able to give that respect to each nuance and to be able to really honour that when it needs to be honoured. So, for example, like you might have someone come forward whose mental health is more prominent, or someone's whose AOD is more prominent. And I guess it's sort of the system kind of follows that, which can be a bit challenging because we know they do go hand in hand. I'm not sure whether that's answered the question, but hopefully it's just provided a bit more context as to why we've gone in this direction where we're only working on AOD. I think it would be great to see some development in dual diagnosis space in this sort of piece of work, but I'm not sure when that will eventuate.
Thank you, Rachael. And I think we've got time for one more question. And I might go to you, Rachael, I think around consideration for training programs to be offered in regional areas. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in the Our Future project, we did have quite a few regional people come forward and just express that concern about the lack of availability for training in their area. Now, what has been done in the consumer space is that we've adapted the peer worker training to an online version. Now, it's my hope that we can develop a family one and I guess replicate that, do the same thing so that we can get that far reach into the regional areas and see that training delivered out there as well. That's
Just to add to that, in an ideal world, we could actually have like a roadshow of the training to take out, because we know face-to-face is, there's another layer, I guess, in the way you engage, but it's all a bit wait and see in terms of what funding is available. But we definitely have the ability to now, go further out into the regional communities with the online version anyway. But
Lovely. Well, thank you both for giving up your time today and sharing everything that's happening within the family carer supporter space and the framework that's coming in June. Looking forward to that. For everyone, we will be sending an email out when the webinar is completed, so keep an eye out for that. But for now, thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks for having us, Ben. It's been a pleasure. Great to come and talk about what we're doing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.